Hello Year 10, welcome to this video lesson on extract from the Prelude by William Wordsworth. In this session we are going to look briefly at William Wordsworth and who he was. We're going to have a think about the Romantic poets and some of the ideas that their writing tends to focus on. We're then going on to read the poem and annotate it together. I'll then give you some prompts for you to annotate your own copy of the poem. We'll then go on to complete some writing, focusing on the power of nature. And finally, I want us to think briefly about how we might compare this poem to another one from the Power and Conflict cluster. So, William Wordsworth, starting to think about the poet himself. He was what we come to know now as a Romantic poet, born and lived in the Lake District in England, and the Prelude was his greatest work, and it was based largely on his travels through Europe and his observations on life. His poetry focuses a lot on the beauty of nature, particular to the Lake District. So if you've ever been to that area of England, you'll know there's, large peaks and mountains, vast lakes and so on. It's a very beautiful place. Now, William Wordsworth, as I've just said, was a Romantic poet. And what we mean by this, we don't necessarily mean it's to do with love, but it's got a wider meaning. So the Romantic movement came about in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, and it covered art, literature, music, and philosophy. And during this period, major transitions took place in society because the intellectuals, so the skilled people in society, started to challenge the establishment. And what this means is they started to formulate thoughts and think about how society could run differently. So they challenged the government and the royal family and so on. And the Romantic poets were at the heart of this movement because what they believed in was this liberty, and what this means is freedom. They also challenged the treatment of the poorer people in society who they felt were being exploited. Now, a key idea associated with what the Romantic poets write about is this idea of the sublime. And what this means is when people feel something, when they see an awesome landscape, and the feeling that they have is fear, admiration, and awe. So it's looking particularly at nature and feeling this is quite an extreme situation, feeling a mixture of both fear of nature and also an admiration of it. Romantic poetry tends to focus largely on nature, although it's not just nature. And when writing about nature, Romantic poets tended to see nature as a force for healing, and they also felt it was very spiritual to be around nature. They also, as it says on the PowerPoint, were the first to recognise the redemptive powers of nature. And what this means is nature kind of being able to save somebody in a sense. So when it says these were pioneers in what became the Back to Nature movement, what this means is that their poetry really stripped things back to look at the beauty and the power of nature. And we definitely see this with William Wordsworth. Other Romantic poets which we have studied are Percy Bysshe Shelley, looking at Ozymandias. Obviously the power of nature comes through there. And also William Blake, writing about London, which, although is not explicitly about nature, does challenge ideas about freedom and the exploitation of the poor. So these were Romantic poets. Now, today's focus, obviously on the Prelude and William Wordsworth, is really about the power of nature. So in this poem, William Wordsworth presents two differing ideas about nature, and this really allows the reader to decide what nature means to themselves. So in the poem, what happens is William Wordsworth explores his childhood thoughts and memories and the way in which he's changed and grown over time. The poem starts with the speaker as a boy and explores his feelings of being at peace with nature and being really at one with nature. However, an event occurs within the poem which changes the speaker's feelings towards the world, and then specifically the natural world, and it represents the boy coming to an age of understanding of what the dangers are in the world. So to recap, the poem is about a journey of a young boy who steals a boat. He doesn't travel very far. He admires, the beauty of the lake and the scenery. He's very comfortable and having an enjoyable experience. However, out of nowhere, he encounters mountains all around him. They totally surround him, and he's fearful of it. He feels threatened by them. So he returns home quickly, but the experience overall haunts him. Okay, I'm going to now read the poem. As you'll see, it's quite a lengthy poem. So I'm going to read the poem with you, and then we'll pause after for some summary. So, one summer evening, led by her, I found a little boat tied to a willow tree within a rocky cove, its usual home. Straight, I unloosed her chain, and stepping in, pushed from the shore. It was an act of stealth and troubled pleasure, nor without the voice of mountain echoes did my boat move on. Leaving behind her still, on either side, small circles glittering idly in the moon, until they melted all into one track of sparkling light. But now, like one who rose proud of his skill to reach a chosen point with an unswerving line, I fixed my view upon the summit of a craggy ridge, the horizon's utmost boundary. Far above was nothing but the stars and the grey sky. She was an elfin pinnace. Lustily, I dipped my oars into the silent lake, and, as I rose upon the stroke, my boat went heaving through the water like a swan, when, from behind that craggy steep till then the horizon's bound, a huge peak, black and huge, as if with voluntary power instinct, upreared its head. I struck and struck again, and growing still in stature, the grim shape towered up between me and the stars, and still, for so it seemed, with purpose of its own and measured motion like a living thing, strode after me. With trembling oars I turned, and through the silent water stole my way back to the covert of the willow tree. There in her mooring place I left my bark, and through the meadows homeward went, in grave and serious mood. But after I had seen that spectacle, for many days my brain worked with a dim and undetermined sense of unknown modes of being. O'er my thoughts there hung a darkness, call it solitude or blank desertion. No familiar shapes remained, no pleasant images of trees, of sea or sky, no colours of green fields, but huge and mighty forms that do not live like living men, moved slowly through the mind by day, and were a trouble to my dreams. Okay, so that's the poem. We know it's about the power of nature, and I've talked briefly about the story of the poem. What I'd like you to do here is just pause the video and write a really brief summary of what you have learned so far based on the poem. So what is it about? What are Wordsworth's thoughts and feelings towards nature? So pause the video. If you need to use the PowerPoint separately just to go back through, that's absolutely fine. Spend 5 minutes doing that, please. Okay, now what I'm going to do is talk through briefly some parts of the poem which will help your understanding and which we can start to sort of get into the analysis of it. So on the first line, we've got one summer evening, and then in brackets, led by her. So straight away, we've got a personification of the boat. And we've also got the reference to summer and the positive connotations that come with this. Summer is a period, obviously, of warmth, of lightness. So the tone of the poem starts quite positively. I then want to go down to the second thing I've highlighted with the small circles glittering idly in the moon. And what we've got here, again, are more references to light. And words like glittering and sparkling and melting all have connotations of the experience being quite heavenly and ethereal. So the surrounding area, as he's rowing on his boat, seems, really a lovely experience. The last thing I've highlighted is him saying that the boat was an elfin pinnace, and I've defined those on the left hand side of the screen. So he's calling the boat elfin, which is small and delicate, and then pinnace just means a small boat. So the way in which he personifies the boat and then describes the experience to be lusty in rowing the boat suggests that he's almost entranced by the experience of rowing his boat. It seems really overwhelming and pleasurable to be out on the boat on the lake. So in this first part of the poem, the general sense is that the act of rowing the boat into the lake is a really positive experience, and the power of nature lies within its beauty. We then move on to the encounter with the mountain, and we have a change of tone here when he describes going from the lightness to the craggy steep and the huge peak. So we've got a change of tone in which the mountains now surround him, and we've switched from lightness to darkness. The mountain seems threatening due to the adjectives he uses to describe them. He also says that the mountain upreared its head, so we've got more personification here of the mountain rising up, and it grows still in stature. He describes it as a grim shape towering up between me and the stars. So this adds to the sense that the mountain is bigger than him. It's a challenge to him. It's more threatening to him, and it seems to get rid of the light. So when it says between me and the stars, the lightness from the previous slide has now gone and it's dark. Now he says that the mountain is like a living thing, so it seems as though the mountain's got quite monstrous qualities, again threatening him. And at this point he now tries to row away from it because the experience has left him shaken. So he goes back to land, moors the boat near the willow tree, and reflects on the experience and the encounter with the mountain. And what he says is that he went home in grave and serious mood, and for many days my brain worked a dim and undetermined sense. He says, over my thoughts there hung a darkness. So what we've got is the idea of the experience changing him and changing his outlook on nature. It seems to have changed his state of mind, in that everywhere he goes now, there's a darkness clouding his thoughts. The references to light have disappeared totally, and it seems that the experience has left him confused about his own position on nature. So whereas previous, he enjoyed being out in nature and there was pleasure to be gained, what he's realised through this experience is that nature is more powerful than man. And because of this, he says no pleasant images of trees, of sea or sky, and so on. So this really is his realisation that man is insignificant compared to the power of nature. So now I've just been through the poem briefly with you. What I'm going to ask you to do is spend 20 to 30 minutes annotating your copy of the poem. And for this, you're going to need the PowerPoint up on the screen, because there's 3 slides with different questions which will prompt you to annotate. So for instance, it asks you to look at line 1 and say who or what is the speaker referring to when he says led by her. So I'm going to ask you to use these questions to help your annotation. If you are struggling at any point, this is a really famous poem and there are tons of resources online and videos on YouTube and so on. So pause the PowerPoint at this, pause the video at this point, go to the PowerPoint copy and use the questions to help you annotate. 20 to 30 minutes on that. Okay, now we've completed that, I want us to think specifically about the power of nature within the poem. And what I'm going to ask you to do, based on what you've just annotated there and also what we've discussed, is pick out 3 quotes which you think show the power of nature within the poem. And for each quote, I want you to think, what does each suggest specifically about nature's power in comparison to the power of man? So we know that in the poem, nature is presented to be really, really powerful, specifically after the experience where he comes across the mountain. So what is William Wordsworth and the speaker suggesting about the power of nature? In looking at your quotes, I want you to try and think, are there any techniques within that quote? So if, for instance, I was to use the opening line of the boat and led by her, I'd be commenting on the use of personification. Okay, now you've got your 3 quotations, what I'm going to ask you to do is complete a writing task on the Prelude. And the question that I want you to focus on is, how is the power of nature presented in the extract from the Prelude? So what you're going to do is use one of your quotations that you've selected on the previous slide to help you answer this question. And I'd like you to try and use the what, how, why formula. So you are going to be thinking, right, what is the power of nature in the poem? How is the power of nature shown in the poem? And why do you think the power of nature is shown in this way? So with the what, you are writing your point, you are using quotes. The how is going to be your analysis. And the why is thinking about why Wordsworth presents nature in this way. And for this is where I would be referencing the Romantic movement and how their poetry focused a lot on nature and the power of nature. I want you to complete a paragraph, so just one on this, and I've got some sentence stems on the right-hand side for you to use if you need to. You don't need to spend any more than 20 minutes completing this. Okay, last thing for us to think about today is comparing the Prelude to other poems. So the Prelude, as we know, focuses mainly on nature's power, how it's more powerful than man, how the landscape of the lake and the mountains are threatening to man, and how experiences and attitudes towards nature can change. And what I want us to think about is where we might see the idea of the power of nature in other poems that we've looked at so far this term. So I've put a few clues on through the pictures, but thinking about other poems, are there any other poems that spring to mind when we think about the power of nature? And then can you think or remember any specific quotes from other poems which show the power of nature, which we might use to compare to the Prelude? So just pausing the video at this point. I don't want you to spend any more than 5 or 10 minutes thinking about how this poem might compare to another that we've looked at, focusing on the power of nature. Okay, that is it for today. I'd ask that you upload the work that you've completed to Teams when you've finished, and I hope to see you all in school next week. Thank you.